The cockpit window exploded. At 17,000 feet. The captain was sucked out, halfway into the sky. At 300 miles per hour, his body slammed against the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot grabbed his legs. And refused to let go. For the next 20 minutes, he held on. And somehow, the captain didn't fall. June 10, 1990. British Airways Flight 5390 was a short flight from Birmingham to Malaga. On board were 81 passengers and 6 crew members. The aircraft was a BAC One-Eleven. It was a calm summer morning. Captain Tim Lancaster had thousands of hours of experience. The co-pilot, Alastair Atchison, was also highly trained. Everything about the flight looked completely routine. The plane took off from Birmingham and began climbing toward its cruising altitude. At around 17,000 feet, Captain Lancaster loosened his shoulder harness and leaned slightly to the side. Then everything changed. Without warning, there was a deafening bang. The left cockpit windshield blew out of the aircraft. The force was unbelievable. Air inside the cabin rushed outward instantly. Captain Lancaster was thrown directly toward the missing window. In less than a second, most of his body was outside the aircraft. Only his legs were still inside. The co-pilot turned and saw something almost impossible. The captain was hanging outside the plane. His back was slammed against the fuselage. His arms were flailing in the wind. His head was striking the side of the aircraft. At 17,000 feet and nearly 300 miles per hour, it looked impossible that anyone could survive. A flight attendant named Nigel Ogden rushed into the cockpit. He saw the captain disappearing out the window. Without even thinking, he grabbed Captain Lancaster around the waist. The co-pilot grabbed his legs. Together, they held on. The wind inside the cockpit was so violent that it was almost impossible to hear anything. Loose papers were flying everywhere. The temperature dropped instantly. The noise was deafening. As Nigel Ogden looked out the empty window frame, his heart sank. The captain's eyes were wide open. Staring back at him, unblinking. His face was a deep shade of blue. To the crew. It was clear, Tim Lancaster was already dead. But they couldn't let him go. They weren't just holding on to their captain. They were holding on to a body they believed was a corpse, knowing that if they released him, his weight would slam into the engine or the tail, destroying the entire plane and killing everyone else. They were holding a dead man to save the living. While all of this was happening, co-pilot Alastair Atchison still had to fly the airplane. He was trying to keep the aircraft stable with one hand. At the same time, he was talking to air traffic control. He declared an emergency and requested the nearest airport. The plane was diverted toward Southampton. Imagine trying to land a damaged aircraft while your captain is hanging outside the window. Alastair Atchison wasn't just flying a broken plane. He was in a race against time. When the cockpit door blew inward, it slammed directly onto the throttle console, pinning the engines forward. The aircraft began to speed up, diving toward the earth at over 300 miles per hour. While the captain was still hanging outside, Atchison had to fight the controls of a plane that was actively trying to go faster. All while wind roared through the cockpit at hurricane speeds. He lowered the aircraft. He lined up for the runway. And somehow, despite the chaos, he made a perfect emergency landing. The aircraft touched down safely at Southampton Airport. The moment the plane stopped, emergency crews rushed to the cockpit. They finally pulled Captain Lancaster back inside, and then came the biggest shock of all. He was alive. Captain Lancaster had spent nearly 20 minutes outside the aircraft. Most people believed there was no chance he could survive. But unbelievably, he did. He suffered multiple fractures, frostbite, bruising, shock. But he survived. Even more incredible, he eventually returned to flying. So what caused the cockpit window to explode? Investigators discovered something terrifying. Just before the flight, the windshield had been replaced. The investigation revealed a terrifying truth. The maintenance manager had replaced the windshield the night before, but he didn't use a manual. He just eyeballed the bolts. He used 84 bolts that were only 0.026 inches. Too small, about the thickness of 3 sheets of paper. Because he wasn't wearing his glasses, he couldn't see the difference. That tiny gap was all it took for the cabin pressure to win, turning a cockpit window into a lethal projectile. When the aircraft climbed and pressure increased, the windshield could no longer hold. And at 17,000 feet, it blew out. A tiny mistake nearly caused a disaster. The story of British Airways Flight 5390 became one of the most unbelievable survival stories in aviation history. Captain Tim Lancaster survived being sucked out of an airplane. The crew saved him by refusing to let go. And co-pilot Alastair Atchison landed the aircraft under impossible conditions. It sounds like a movie. But every part of it is real. And maybe the craziest part is this: for nearly 20 minutes, a man was hanging outside an airplane at 17,000 feet. And he lived. Tim Lancaster went back to flying just 5 months later. If you were him, would you ever step on a plane again? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe. Because there are even more unbelievable stories that actually happened.